Welcome to MF Garza Law Firm, helping injured victims, one Texan at a time.
Hello, and welcome back to MF Garza Law Firm, helping injured victims, one Texan at a time, with Miguel Garza. Miguel is the founder of the MF Garza Law Firm, where he fights for Texans injured in accidents ranging from car and trucking crashes to catastrophic injuries. I'm Leanne Lyon, and today we're talking about highway construction accidents in Texas and what it takes to prove fault when traffic control plans and safety violations are involved. Miguel, highway construction crashes often involve more than just two drivers. In these cases, who are the potential parties that can actually be held responsible?
Sure. Well, the short answer is it depends, but obviously the other driver that's involved in this wreck is certainly one. But when there's a construction zone, in particular an active construction zone going on, there's a lot of different factors that'll be taken into consideration, like signage, lighting, was there proper notifications, barrels, cones, flaggers, things like that, that need to be taken into consideration and abide by what's called a traffic control plan or the actual construction plans that are pre-approved by the state or an engineer. So depending on how the wreck occurred, did somebody not see something, or was something obstructed, such as or there was a hazard in the road that somebody could not visually see because of an obstruction, things like that can be taken into consideration. And as opposed to just the other driver being at fault, it might actually be a contractor or a general contractor, or in extreme cases, potentially the government that could be at fault for some type of liability in that situation.
So let's talk about that traffic control plan. How does it factor into determining whether a construction zone was set up safely?
Sure. So a traffic control plan is a state and engineer approved roadway design to safely accommodate the flow of traffic for active and inactive construction zones. Highway construction projects take years to create, and they have to go through a very rigorous approval process and involves public hearings with government officials like TxDOT, engineers, architects, and other approved contractors. So the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials are the ones that create safety standards and guidelines for construction zone. So most states adopt these standards and guidelines into their own policies and guidelines. And as long as the state and their approved engineers and contractors abide by those national standards, then generally speaking, a construction zone, it should be considered safe for the traveling public. But once the construction plans are finalized, then bids are taken to see who will be the general contractor for the project. The general contractor and their subcontractors have to abide by the construction plans, which includes traffic control plans for different phases of the project. There's usually anywhere from 1 to 8 or 9 phases, depending on how long the project will take. So not one contractor on the project can alter the traffic control plan during any phase of the construction project without prior written consent or approval from the engineer or the general contractor. But let's face it, not every contractor abides by those standards and plans, even though they're required to. And that's when attorneys like myself may have to get involved if someone is tragically injured or possibly worse, to determine if any of those standards were violated.
So how do OSHA standards and other safety regulations come into play when somebody is injured in a highway work zone?
So obviously, OSHA's primary concern there is safety, right? So best practice for OSHA standards is basically having a safety management program that typically includes site-specific safety plans for a project, task safety planning, hazard recognition, hazard elimination, things like documentation of such hazards and sharing such information with workers and, if applicable, the public. And then, of course, the most important thing is training for all levels of employees on such topics to make sure that all those particular issues are addressed. And then there's other things like transportation codes, like the rules of the road that have to be followed, things like the federal motor carrier safety regulations that commercial motor vehicles have to abide by, and then other things like engineering guidelines that have to be followed. So, a number of different things that apply there, and usually that's all taken into consideration when these plans are created. But then it usually is falls on the general contractor or the subcontractor to abide by the OSHA standards specifically. And they usually have somebody that's OSHA certified and make sure that their employees comply with OSHA training.
In your experience, what kind of failures in signage, lane closures, or barriers tend to lead to serious crashes?
So signage is definitely a big one because, as most people know, you got to provide notice to the public if there's, something occurring at that time in an active construction zone or even an inactive construction zone. If there's no notice or signage to the public, no one is going to know specifically that they may be approaching a hazardous condition in the roadway, a pothole, change in direction of the roadway, things like that, or maybe just approaching a lane closure or concrete barriers up ahead. So really depends on that. And other things are, things like lighting. If they are conducting work at nighttime, they got to have appropriate lighting to provide notice to the public, like oscillating lights. If they are working in a particular area that is extremely dark, they have to have enough light to make sure everybody is working there, and that's a sufficient lights to give notice to the public. And then usually the barriers, things like that, all the barriers have to be, affixed and make sure that they abut the roadway consistently and there's no gaps in there. And of course, all work has to remain on the interior side of the barrier and cannot intrude into a roadway, especially when there's active traffic going on.
So when multiple contractors and subcontractors are working on the same project, as you talked about, how is liability sorted out between them?
It can be kind of complicated, but before a contractor can be approved to work on a project, they have to produce a company safety manual that shows the government, the DOT, the general contractor, et cetera, that subcontractor or contractor has systems in place to ensure that their employees are working safely at all times, not just for the safety of their employees, but for the public. That manual must be produced to those entities and include things like the type of training, how often it occurs, if an accident happens, what procedures must be followed, who from the company investigates the incident, and how the company may address that incident so it doesn't happen in the future. The general contractor on the project also sets out safety guidelines that all subcontractors on a project must follow. If the subcontractor does not follow their own or the general contractor's safety guidelines, and someone is severely injured or even worse, then generally that subcontractor will be the first party responsible for any injury. Then typically the general contractor will be secondary or liable after that subcontractor pays out their policy limits if the case does go that far.
So what evidence becomes especially important in construction zone cases that might not matter as much as in a standard car accident?
Good question. And, there's a wide range of issues that need to be considered, but barriers are very important. As I said earlier, that all construction work is supposed to remain behind the barriers and cannot intrude into the lanes without prior approval. Construction work, obviously has to be approved and abide by the traffic control plan. So if work entered a roadway past a concrete barrier or a large orange barrel and it causes a wreck, the contractor working the scene will more than likely be responsible for that wreck and any damages that person or persons sustain. Lighting is a very important one. Work has to be done at night. It has to be pre-approved by the general contractor and the lead engineer. And there must be sufficient lighting to give notice to the public that there's active work being done to a roadway. And that light cannot be obstructed by anything, such as like a large piece of machinery, like an excavator or bulldozer. That light has to be before any work being done so they can see the light without any obstruction. If that light is behind something like a heavy piece of machinery and is not completely visible to the public and a wreck occurs, then that person operating that machinery could be responsible for not having proper lighting and giving proper notice to the public. Obviously, there's the traffic control plans as well. If a traffic control plan is altered by a contractor and it wasn't approved by the lead engineer or the general contractor beforehand in writing, then that's a big issue as well. And that contractor can be responsible for altering that plan without approval. And then one of the most important pieces of information or evidence in any case is pictures and videos. Was there a dash cam on any of the vehicles involved or any of the nearby vehicles? Body cam videos from law enforcement are extremely crucial, in my opinion, in such cases because there's usually more than one construction worker at the scene, right? And each worker could have seen something different. It might have a different story to tell, and there's multiple officers on the scene, and might give you, tell you what they're doing at the time. And when I've reviewed hours of these photos, of these videos and footage and things like that, it's helped ensure a great resolution for my clients, because it's usually someone's telling or giving misleading information or telling a lie to the police or to their employers or contractors. So videos are extremely important, and I've had a lot of cases get a good resolution because of such videos.
Are there situations where a government entity can be involved in responsibility for how a construction zone was designed or approved?
Well, the short answer is yes. But the government usually contracts with different entities like engineering firms, construction companies, et cetera, which basically limits their liability. For example, TxDOT usually hires an engineer to design the highways or roadways and create the traffic control plans during different phases of the construction project. If it turns out that that design was faulty for whatever reason and contributed to an accident, the engineer who designed that construction plans or the design plans would bear the responsibility for most of the damages in that scenario. Also, the government can have immunity in certain cases, or their liability will be capped at a certain amount. And in such cases involving construction projects that might lead to an injury or even a death, TxDOT has a cap that can be paid out of only $250,000 in damages. So the government tends to have immunity or some type of limitation on how much can be allocated as far as responsibility for them. So it's part of the legislation. It's happened for years, and that's typically why the government contracts these bids out to other professionals to conduct that and limit their liability as well.
So, how does the investigation process differ when heavy equipment or commercial vehicles are part of the work zone environment?
Well, the first thing that must be done in any commercial motor vehicle wreck, if it's significant enough, is you got to hire what's called an accident reconstructionist engineer, right? It's kind of self-explanatory. That accident reconstructionist engineer will recreate the accident by taking measurements. They'll do digital scans, videos, photos, measurements, and basically download data from any of the vehicles that might be involved in the wreck. Also check brakes or check for any other potential maintenance issues that could have contributed to the wreck. In certain cases, if it's a fatality, and the law enforcement agency investigating the wreck may have their own accident reconstruction crew. And if there's a fatality, they'll go and do all that, because if you hire an accident reconstruction engineer, it's going to cost a lot of money, like tens of thousands of dollars potentially. So if you can have the government do it, it's obviously much cheaper and better for everybody. But when it comes to heavy construction equipment like bulldozers and excavators, they're extremely tech-driven nowadays. They have a wealth of safety features like sensors, cameras, GPS, emergency shutdown systems. They're just like cars. And data from such heavy equipment can be obtained as well to see what programs are being used at the time of the wreck, what lights were on, even showing if perhaps the cab door was open when it should have been closed at the specific time of the wreck. Obtaining that information in a timely manner is extremely important, because, that's why I advise to hire a lawyer, because that data or information may be deleted or will just not be maintained if it's not collected within a certain time frame. So it's extremely important to go and acquire that information as soon as possible, just to make sure that you can have the best case possible to get a good resolution.
So, as we wrap up today's episode, and from a litigation standpoint, what makes highway construction accident cases more complex than they may appear at first glance?
For one, I would say just the amount of people or entities involved. Whenever there's a large highway construction project going on, you got, like I said, you got state, you got engineers, you got construction companies, you got subcontractors, general contractors, and then of course you got the traveling public. Not to mention the contractors' employees. So a wealth of information can be obtained from any of those entities. Like I said, were the contractors and employees complying with company guidelines and safety protocols? that they contracted and said that they would comply with. You know, a lot of times they tend to cut corners and try to get the job done as soon as possible because they're usually on some type of time frame or time crunch when they sign these contracts to complete these big construction projects. And so it can be challenging in all aspects, especially if you got a commercial motor vehicle involved. Like I said, you might want to get some engineers involved, your own, and do your own investigation because unfortunately, sometimes law enforcement may not just have the most capable people or may not even have the right people on staff to go and conduct a thorough investigation to get all the information necessary to tell the complete story. So pretty complex. And again, I'd highly encourage anybody to go and hire an experienced lawyer that has dealt with such situations and specifically construction highway accidents because they can be extremely complex.
Agreed. Experience means a lot. So that is it for today's episode of MF Garza Law Firm, helping injured victims one Texan at a time. If you'd like to learn more about Miguel Garza and how he represents Texans injured in serious accidents, visit mfgarzalaw.com to explore additional resources and case information. And as always, remember to like, subscribe, and leave a review if you found this episode helpful. Thank you, Miguel.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.